Ole Anderson, I questioned him. I grilled Ole in the lobby because this is a subject that I was reading actually Don Fargo's new autobiography, which I got the first day of FanFest. Scott Teal's done a great job. Don Fargo, possibly one of the most fascinating wrestlers that has ever lived. And was probably the only guy that worked on network television for the DuMont network in the early 50s and worked on ESPN in the 90s. His book came out, and that started me thinking, because it talked about the many promotions that he'd worked for. And then I got to started thinking about how now that the wrestling business is folding up and constricting and being smaller constantly, and whatever happens with TNA and Spike TV or wherever they end up on television, they're cutting people. The WWE has cut more people, released more people. And wrestling is supposed to be this big multi-million-dollar industry. And up until a few weeks ago, when the stock market told him different, the guy who owns the biggest company was supposed to be a billionaire, right? Then how come nobody's making any fucking money in the wrestling business except for like 40 guys, maybe? And I realized that Ole is one of the last guys that can speak of this in a first-person account. And so I got some information from him. And you looked up a piece for me. Ole Anderson was a main event wrestler, but he also was smart enough to become a booker, matchmaker, whatever you want to call it. And he also was smart enough to get ownerships or percentages in the businesses that he worked for and was integral to. He was not only a main event guy, he was also the booker in a lot of places or a lot of instances. And he ended up owning and was the majority owner until Vince turned that south, the Georgia territory. So the point I'm making is in the late 1970s, let's say 1978, for example, Ole Anderson, because he was being paid as a main event wrestler, because he had a percentage of the towns from Jim Barnett that he booked for Barnett, anywhere from 2% of a town to 4% of a town. Ole was making over $250,000 a year in 1978. And you looked up and translated it into today's money, that's $750,000. Yeah. Now, Ole was very unusual, but I can think of other people, Jerry Lawler, who had 10% of Memphis. Now I'm doing King's tax returns on the air, but I'm sorry. Jerry Lawler had 10% of Memphis from, the time that Jerry Jarrett split off from Nick Goulas until 1983 when he became a 50% partner in the company. But just on having 10% of Memphis and working as a main event wrestler in the Tennessee territory, I was in Louisville Gardens one night when they were handing out the paychecks. And this was right around Christmas of 1982. And Lawler gave me my check, and it was like $500 or $600. And, I'm 22 years old, and I'm a junior manager. I just made $600 for working 6 days. I'm happy to be there, right? Yeah. But I look on his desk in the little office he had in the Gardens, and there his check was just laying there it was just not covered up by anything, right on top. And it was for $3,842 or so, 38 something. And he saw me looking at it, and he said, yeah, maybe Lawler's always been a little of a wise ass. It's part of his charm. He said, maybe if you stay in the business long enough, Jim, you'll end up getting a check like that. And of course, me being wide-eyed and innocent, I said, Jerry, was that just for last week? He said, no, that was for last Monday. He had 10% of Memphis. So him and Bockwinkel in the AWA World Title match drew a $38,000 gate. He got $3,800 for, going to work 12 miles from his house. And that's in addition to wrestling in the main event in Louisville and main event in Nashville and whatever. So that week he probably, he made between $5,000 and $6,000. I would think that his average weeks, according to the houses in Memphis, were $2,000 to $4,000. So
and remember, we can triple that basically in today's.
Yeah, this is 1982, and he probably, and that's without, and he was also working in that year in Florida, and he also made shots in the AWA. So everybody says, why didn't Jerry Lawler ever leave Memphis really and go anywhere and stay instead of just making shots? Why the fuck would he? Because once again, you tripled that. And that's what I'm trying to get across, is that a lot of people don't realize that it was easy. It was easy to be an underneath guy and, make $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 a year in the wrestling business 30 years ago. Everybody in the business was doing that, and there were hundreds of them because there was 25 territories. But for the people who say, well, the guys didn't make big money until Vince came along. Yeah, if you got to be a main event star in your territory where you either got the book or you got a percentage or you bought into the whole thing or you were a main event guy like an Ernie Ladd who flew between the New York territory and the Buffalo territory and the Texas territory and wherever, and the Mid-Atlantic, wherever, because he was an international star in the 70s, the NWA world champion. We've already talked about with Larry Madisick how the payoff for an NWA world title match on a sellout house in St. Louis was $6,000 or better for the night. So they were making $200,000, $300,000 or $400,000, $500,000 a year. Just the schedule would kill you. There were big money spots in professional wrestling, and when you take into account the number of territories and the number of really big names, there were easily 40 guys making, low six figures in the wrestling business as promoters or bookers or matchmakers or main event talents. And now there's 40 fucking guys. Some of them are making millions. But I wonder, maybe somebody should do this research, as we've gotten completely off topic here and I go on this rant. Somebody should do this research, Alice, and figure out how many wrestlers working for the WWE and TNA are making, potentially after they pay all their road expenses, which most of these guys still do, are making six figures in the wrestling business anymore. I don't think it's as many as everybody thinks.
I wouldn't think so either. And I imagine a lot of that has to be down to the fact that WWE is this giant corporate entity. I'm going to assume, and you can correct me, of course, that in the territories, there can't have been that much corporate infrastructure. Go on.
To quote Guy Coffey, they run $1 million business like a flea market.
And that's why, that way you could basically pass that money directly onto the workers, because it's not going to.
Well, no,
imagine
the money was never passed directly onto the workers.
Well, not directly,
well,
but
not even indirect.
I mean.
Actually, very indirectly. We used to call it running it through the separator. When Eddie Marlin in Memphis, there was a bag man in every territory. The bag man was the guy that was in charge by the owner and the boss of the whole territory, bringing the money back from spot shows and places that settled in cash. And those guys were generally old, well-respected wrestlers, family members, both, generally armed, people that you wouldn't want to fuck with, and most of all, trustworthy. And for Jerry Jarrett, it was Eddie Marlin, who fit all of those categories. But there was a different one in each territory. I'm sure Bronco Lubitsch carried a few satchels full of money around in the Texas territory. But the point is, the promoters would leave buildings. When we ran Bogalusa, Louisiana one time for Mid-South Wrestling, and the high school football field, and it did a $35,000 house or $40,000 house. There were over 3,000 people there. And most of those purchased their tickets as they walked up. There was a hell of a jam at the box office. And it's a high school fucking football field. It's not, Ticketmaster wasn't involved in this, right? There was no surcharges. And you were driving back country roads in any territory in the country with suitcases with $20,000 and $30,000 and $40,000 in cash in it.
And I guess this was a time when there wasn't a branch of your local bank every single place you went.
Well, and you didn't want to take it to the bank right then anyway, because first you took it back to the office and you ran it through the separator.
Right.
And what you did was you put it all in a bushel basket and all the cash, and you threw it up in the air, and whatever stuck to the ceiling, that's what you paid the talent. And but no, in all honesty, being a wrestling promoter was a license to print money. I'm sure that all of that cash didn't get documented. When you go back and look at the records and you see the sheer numbers of people that went to wrestling matches and all the territories, it was a license to print money in some respects. If you got your territory off the ground, got it going, got it successful, got it established, kept good talent in, that whole 9 yards. I mean, territories did go out of business, but for the good ones, and there were a lot of them, So and there were there were under the table deals made all the time with guys. Jimmy Valiant was so important to the Memphis territory. He wanted to go to the Carolinas where he could make more money per week because the towns were bigger. But Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler bought him a house in Memphis. Not a giant mansion, but a fucking house. This was 1981 or whatever. So what did a house go for in Memphis in 1981 to get him to stay? And he talks about it in his book. He stayed a few months, but then, he just knew he had to go to the Carolinas. And so he left the keys to the house in their mailbox and left them a note that said, "Sorry, Kingfish, got to go." And that's so anyway, guys could work themselves into top spots. There were more of them. There were more territories to learn. And it may not have been possible for a wrestler to make $1 million, although some promoters did in the course of a year. But a lot more guys were making money. And I had that conversation with Ole, and he gave me some firsthand account. And everybody say, "Oh, Ole exaggerates." But no, when you put together the figures and the facts, it's fucking true. And it was a practice for promoters to give their bookers a guarantee per week above their wrestling pay or a percentage of the town or whatever. So it was based on their performance and everything. That was done in a lot of cases. That's how Georgia got fragmented and ended up enough people owned enough percentage that Vince was able to get it out from under Ole to begin with.